Welcome to the Pastor and Priestess podcast.
I'm JT, a pastor from the Christian tradition.
I'm Allison, a priestess of the divine feminine.
We come from different lineages, which have not always played well together.
As we bring them together, we are seeking a wholeness, a sacred union that transforms self and society.
On this podcast, we'll explore how to bring together, in sacred union, polarities known across spiritual teachings in various ways.
Divine feminine and divine masculine,
Yin and yang,
Shiva and Shakti,
sun and moon,
emptiness and form,
heaven and earth. We will also bring together spirituality, psychology, and science.
And we'll talk about spiritual ideas that are both ancient and emerging.
As the pastor
And the priestess,
we are walking a path of sacred union,
and we invite you to join us.
Welcome to the Pastor and Priestess podcast. We are so pleased today to welcome Barry Johnson from his home in Michigan to our studio here in Colorado. What a pleasure. And we're going to explore something super important today that has to do with what keeps us together as a society and individuals, and what kind of tears us apart. Yeah.
Well, I'm delighted, Barry. I'm so delighted to have you here with us. It's been, I think it's been 16 years since we met in person. And before that, I was introduced to your work probably back in 2002 or 2003 by one of my early mentors, Herb Stevenson from the Gestalt Institute in Cleveland. And I had read your book. And then when I was doing my intensive Gestalt training program for organizational development people like me, you showed up on the faculty in 2004, I believe it was. And I was just so thrilled and delighted, not only to meet you in person and to learn from you directly, but then on top of all of that, to discover your character and your heart and your beingness in the world, which is, you just became one of my favorite people on the planet. And so I have considered you to be my teacher and my mentor for all this time. And so did a lot of study with you around polarity thinking, which is what we're going to talk about today. And I'm just delighted. I'm kind of tickled in my heart to have you here. Barry, thank you. Barry is also on the board of directors of the Sanctuary for Sacred Union, which we are just launching this year in 2020, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Babe, do you want to give a little bit more of his biographical info? That was kind of my heart story.
I can do that. I won't give the long version, but Barry was born in Rice Lake, Wisconsin, eventually found himself at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire in the mid-60s. Found his way to Union Theological in New York City for a few years, and that's what got him on an internship program in East Harlem, where he lived for 5 years. And by 1970, Barry realized he wanted to understand how to develop organizations, communities, and nations that functioned well for all, rather than just protest when they became oppressive for many. So while Barry continues to protest as called and as needed, he's been working for years to deal with the conditions that lead to that kind of protest. And so he wrote a book that I read and have been taught by my spouse in a basic class on polarity management, identifying and managing unsolvable problems. I've also read your book on managing polarities in congregations, which was pretty helpful and usually an eye-opener for most people in the conventional church. Well, I think that's all I want to name from this, but I can see in this bio that there's a long-standing passion to address these painful parts of our living together as a society, and I'm sure there's some of that you realize at the individual level as well in your Gestalt time as a Gestalt therapist and so forth. So welcome again. I'm excited. Let's go deeper.
Yeah, so I'll just, before we invite you to speak, Barry, I just want to say, why are we doing this interview in the first place? we wanted to introduce you as a board member around the Sanctuary for Sacred Union.
Mhm.
We wanted to introduce this concept of polarity thinking.
And the new book.
And Barry's new book, which has
Called-
just been out for only about a month now.
Mhm.
It's called And Making a Difference by Leveraging Polarity, Paradox, and Dilemma. This is your third book, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, there's an unpublished small book called All that I wrote actually right as I was leaving college, between college and seminary, that all of us belong on this lovely planet, and all of us belong in whatever follows leaving this lovely planet. So,
Indeed.
that one is never published, but so 3 are published. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to invite you to introduce our audience to this concept of polarities. Really at the basic level, what can you say about your life's work and this whole theory that you've developed around the word and?
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you. My heart was just warming and swelling as you were talking about our history, Allison. So, so what we're talking about when we talk about polarities are those dimensions of life in which you have 2 parts, and it makes more sense to connect those 2 parts with the word and than to connect them with the word or. And for example, it doesn't make any sense to ask whether we are going to choose between inhaling or exhaling, because all of us know from our life experience from birth that we need to do both. So we need to inhale and exhale. So at the most fundamental level, there are these dimensions of life in which they come as a pair. It doesn't matter if you like it. It doesn't matter if it fits with how you think or act. The reality is that inhaling and exhaling are a gift to us, and they come as a set. You can't just inhale and never exhale. So it's foolish when you have something in which and is required. It's foolish to use or, and it becomes a real disaster when you use or. So that's the essence of it. I'd like to share just another quick example of how this works with activity and rest. Yet another polarity that we all live inside of. We can't go someplace and decide whether we're going to do activity and rest. We live within the phenomena of activity and rest. So, we get up in the morning, we do whatever we do, and at night we go back to sleep unless we're working graveyard shift in a plant, then we shift the order. But no matter, at some point within 24 hours, we will move through activity and rest. So this is something that all of us do. And just to share a little bit about how a polarity looks in terms of what we call a polarity map, is that you have the 2 pole names on the polarity, so like activity and rest. And with every polarity, there will be a contribution that each pole brings, and there will be a limitation to each pole, especially without the other. So for example, we get up in the morning, and we get out and do something. So we're physically, mentally active. We get the benefits of that stimulation and encouragement, enthusiasm. We get a lot of benefits of just being physically and mentally active. So it's obviously a great thing. But if we just focused on activity without focusing on rest, we would experience the limits of activity alone, which looks like the downside of that pole. And so that's burnout, just totally exhausted. So at night, we end up going to bed because we're experiencing the limits of activity alone, and we need to get the benefits of rest. In that move from the downside of activity towards the upside of rest, that we move to the upside of what rest brings to us. And that is relaxation, centeredness, peacefulness, rejuvenation. And so when we're burned out, the movement towards rest and rejuvenation makes absolute sense. And it would be easy to consider it a solution to a problem. I'm burned out, I need to get rest. At one level, that's true. At another level, it's not a sustainable solution alone. So rest without its partner activity, if you gets into the downside of rest alone. So rest alone looks like atrophy of the muscles. It looks like boredom, lack of energy. So after, you don't want to stay in bed for 30 days. You want to get up every morning and get out and do something because you need to get the benefits of activity. So you're oscillating through this infinity loop that oscillates around the two poles and between them. When it goes between them, this energy, it literally keeps them differentiated. So activity and rest are differentiated dimensions. When the energy wraps around them, it holds them together. So we have this infinity loop that does two things. It differentiates the two, says these are separate phenomena in life, and it says they come as a set. So it just wraps them gently as a pair. So this is how all polarities work.
I'm really, I just want to highlight how much I really love the fact that one of the things that is brought to me is a sense of how to work with this. So for example, I think for a long time I've had some sense of balance is a good thing in the world. Mm-hmm. And it's in some ways easy to see in many fields, the homeostasis that you get in biology class, that kind of concept. And there was something in me that always wanted to know what that balance was, or was inclined to seek it.
Yeah.
But the inclination to seek it is not necessarily a map to how to get there. And so polarities for me is a wonderful map that helps me get inside of what's happening here. Why isn't this balance happening? Or what could I do? And so I love that shift to leveraging, because I think it really uplifts the dynamic part of this map, that you can get in and understand, oh, these are the actions and these are the warnings. You can find a way to get in there and work it out, or at least lay out a plan to work it out. And it goes from this most simple and illustrative example of in-breathing and out-breathing, mm-hmm. which anyone can access. But then it's able to scale up in complexity to something which you simply outlined in marathon training, but which goes further. So that's a tremendous contribution to me, and I think to lots of people.
Yeah, the other that brings up for me, like the contribution for me, Barry, from your work has been the humanization that polarity thinking can bring to us, that it allows us to see the other. And this is so important in today's world, I think, mm-hmm. more important than ever in today's world, that we learn to see the other as part of a greater whole, that there's, as you mentioned, there's two poles and they're differentiated. They're not the same. Like, for example, well, in the way that I talk about things, a lot of times there's like a masculine value and a feminine value. Yeah. They're not the same. And they are two aspects of a greater whole. So sort of like the idea of thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis of the whole. And so when we have that and we can see another person who has the opposite perspective than we hold, if we can see that that's just the opposite perspective and the two are actually interdependent, then we get to see the other person in a more humanizing, more loving way, instead of dehumanizing each other. When we don't agree with someone's perspective, they hold the opposite pole to our favorite one. Maybe you can give some examples of that. But I love this quote from your book, focusing on one pole, right, to the neglect of the interdependent good, mm-hmm. leads us to unintended evil.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the gifts of the phenomena of polarities. And just to build on what both of you have said, the phenomena of interdependent pairs exist in the world just like sunlight and gravity. I mean, it's a phenomenon that's available to all of us. pointing to it and being excited about it is a fun occupation I've been doing for a while now, since 1975. But what's important is not the one who's pointing, but what we're pointing at. So the three of us are all in this conversation together. We're all looking in amazement and excitement about this phenomenon. And so that's what's important to pay attention to. If you have one of these phenomena, if you do have an interdependent pair, then there will be an essential contribution that each pole brings to us. Like inhaling brings us oxygen, but exhaling cleans out carbon dioxide. So it's like each pole brings something, and also each pole is vulnerable to the absence of the other pole. So if you have inhaling without exhaling, you're going to be blue in the face soon because the cycle time is so short. And so if you are polarized, we talk about polarization a lot today because it's manifest so strongly in so many areas. If the polarization is around a polarity, then there will be two upsides. There will be wisdom from each of the groups that are in polarization. They will be bringing an upside value or positive dimension that is not only essential, they're essential for each other. So not only are both sides right, both sides need each other. And this, so anyway, this becomes extremely humanizing, as you said, Allison. And let me talk about how it gets dehumanizing. I'll just share an example of this. If we look at within virtually all religious traditions, there is some version of an all-loving God. God is love. God is loving. There's unconditional love, and there's a message that we're accountable for our actions. I can remember I was a facilitator at the Parliament of World Religions a number of years ago, and I was doing sort of informal research on polarity thinking and this phenomenon itself about an all-loving God and this sense of accountability. And I talked with a Tibetan Buddhist monk, and I said to him, my background is Christian tradition, Lutheran Christian tradition. And I said, in my tradition, we have this notion of an all-loving God and accountability. It's called law and grace, or justice and mercy. And I said, is there something like that within Tibetan Buddhism, And he smiled, put his hands together, smiled just very, slowly and gently. And he laid his hands out, his two palms, and with a big smile, he said, on the one hand, we have an all-loving God, and on the other hand, we have karma. And it was so quick and so easy. Well, of course there is. Here's how we call it. So this dimension of unconditional love and accountability is one of the fundamental polarities that show up in virtually all of our traditions. And another one that is very parallel to it, and that is that all of us are connected, and each of us is unique. So those two polarities, and by the way, this is a given. We don't have to do something to become unique. We're born unique, and every moment of our life and every experience we have actually adds another facet to our uniqueness. So we actually are born unique, and we become more unique as we go through life. The other truth is we are connected. We're born connected, and as we go through life, we become more and more aware of that connectedness. So those two key polarities are just essential. Now let's look at the law and grace one for a second, how we get into trouble. If we think in a linear either or session, either or arrangement with law itself, we might say, well, if some laws are good, which I say they are, this is the two goods now. You got one good, which is law, the other good, which is mercy or grace. So we focus on the one. We say, well, if some laws are good, then more laws would be better. So, okay, so now you can see where this is headed. It's headed towards more and more and more laws, right? Now, the other thing that happens along with this trip, just pursuing law, is, well, actually laws without consequences are just irrelevant. So we have to have consequences. So, well, if some consequences are effective in terms of the law, harsher consequences would probably be more effective. So where this is headed, if you just pursue law without grace, is more and more laws and harsher consequences. Now, where this is headed is to a culture or a society or an internal sense of self that leads to being cruel to either yourself and or to others. So, for example, this can lead to us stoning a woman to death because we find out that she is pregnant out of wedlock. Not only do we stone her to death, we do it self-righteously. Now, how did we get there? How did we get to that evil, which I consider evil? Stoning a woman to death for being pregnant, I consider that to be an evil consequence. But where did it come from? Well, it came from focusing on law to the neglect of grace. And so the mercy allows us to understand, to forgive, to recognize there, but for my own circumstances go I. And so that's how we find ourselves in a tragic downside of a pole, and how you support one good to the neglect of another good. The righteousness of law without the righteousness of grace leads to just self-righteous indignation and punishment. Now, if you overfocus on grace to the neglect of law, what happens is you can tolerate the abuse of the woman being stoned rather than stepping in to prevent it. And so that's the downside of grace without law, is nobody's held accountable for anything. And we need to hold ourselves and others accountable. So how do we wrestle with this combination of being loved unconditionally and holding ourselves and others accountable? That's a great polarity question. How do we do this well? But we clearly need to do both, because either alone just becomes dysfunctional, just like inhaling without exhaling. It's that basic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Beautiful example. Thank you. I'm kind of heart-wrenching.
Yeah, there's an interesting dance there, of a powerful one between, you might say, good and evil, and in a way, polarity, leveraging, viewing things in polarities is one way to get inside of how did we get to this terrible place.
Yeah. Yes.
How did we think of ourselves as well-intended people, but this is what we're doing?
Yes. Yes.
Right. And this leads, just to build on that, JT, is the one of the realities that shows up when you understand how polarities work is that the quest for an evil source is a tragic quest, and a polarity lens allows us to see that we can find ourselves with evil results without having to find some evil source to blame upon whom to project essentially stuff we can't own.
Yes.
So that's what happens when you create a culture in which you have a lot of laws and a lot of harsh consequences. You get people who are either extremely guilty and so they end up abusing themselves. Like when I was 13, for example, just to be real clear about this, when I was 13, I started being attracted to women, to girls, right? And so it's a natural thing, right? We all agree there's this natural attraction. I could have been attracted to other boys, or could have been attracted to women, but I found myself attracted to young girls. And I was, at that time, I thought I was going to be a Lutheran minister. So I was already in my career path at 13, right? and so I thought, man, this is lust. This is sin. And so what am I going to do with this feeling of, and of course that attraction grew. So it became more and more anxiety producing for me when I was looking under the law side, because if your eyes, cause you, it's not just what you do, it's what you think, what you imagine. So you're vulnerable, 6 ways to Sunday on this thing. And so I read this chapter. If your eyes, cause you to sin, it's better to pluck out your eyes than to, and go into heaven than it is to have your eyes and go into hell. So now I'm reading this as a 13-year-old, and I'm thinking, I'm scared to death I'm going to go to hell, right? I mean, this whole law thing,
Right.
this kind of internalized fear. So I thought, well, if I plucked out one eye, I'd still be able to see girls with the other eye. So that would do it. So what I thought was, if I grabbed a scissors and put the if I did it just right, I could poke out both eyes simultaneously. Now this is what goes on in the mind of a 13-year-old who's caught in the downside of law without grace, of justice without mercy. And it's self-imposed. Nobody told me, you know what I mean? It's like this was just working with what was coming at me from the culture, from what I was experiencing in the church. This is what it said in the Bible. There's this verse that says this. So nobody told me I needed to poke my eyes out, but that's what I was seriously considering doing. Then fortunately for me, I was afraid to do it. I couldn't get myself to do it. Then, of course, now not only was I a sinner, I was a coward. So look at look at what's happening to this 13-year-old kid,
Right.
who's trying to take this religious thing that I was raised in Sunday school and all, was how I was distorting it in a way that was harmful to me. Well, we also distort it in ways that are harmful to others. So, by the way, I would be very likely to be the one who would be stoning this woman for being pregnant in this self-righteous indignation, caught up in the law, and now project, because I couldn't own my own stuff, but in fact, my being attracted to my own, I couldn't own my own sexuality and my own fantasies or whatever. So I project my stuff about me onto her. And I literally, not only do I project it on her, I project the pain on her by throwing a stone at her.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is how this works at an individual level. If you take it to the national level, you don't throw a stone. We're more sophisticated. We just bomb the hell out of somebody. But it's the same projection. We identify an evil source and project on them, and then self-righteously abuse them. So, yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah,
I have not heard that story before, Barry.
Yeah. Thank
It's
you.
really, really, really got me there with your
It's
13-year-old
It's
self.
impactful, and I appreciate that share because it does illustrate, in a sense, you owning your own story. Thank you. It does help us see that this way of understanding is more than something you put on paper as a clever theory and a black and white kind of satisfying exercise academically. It is something trying to track real world interactions that have real world outcomes of suffering and injustice or liberation and peace. The way of life or the way of death, as they say in the old Hebrew scriptures in Deuteronomy. Yeah, this to me is the way of life, and I really appreciate that aspect of it, that we're getting right into things that we might call shadow projection or injustice. It's all right there when this is not done well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and it also leads me into a conversation that I wanted to have with you, Barry, around when we choose one pole over the other, and then when we continue to do that in a pattern of choosing, I'll say, for example, what I would call choosing the masculine poles, the masculine values over the feminine ones, which society has been doing for over 5,000 years, we get something like patriarchy. So when you continue to choose law over grace, when you continue to choose activity over rest, when you continue to choose competition over collaboration, when you continue to choose the interests of the part, for example, the interests of your one little company over the interests of the whole planet and the environment that it's drawing on.
Yeah.
You know, when you stack those value choices over time, you get something that I would call evil, which is patriarchy, which is the dominance overall of this whole system of masculine values.
So you all were getting into some really interesting territory around what I've come to know as a master polarity. There are certain polarities that are very deep and they encompass quite a bit. And there's research to look at that around masculine and feminine, archaeological, historical research to indicate that for 5,000 years we've been on the masculine pole, dominant. Often people refer to this as patriarchy, but that it runs in many cultures and has been running for a long, long time. And that's pretty important to the work we're doing, launching this project, the Sanctuary for Sacred Union. And I think it's important in all of this polarity world. And I would love to hear you two talk about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what I was saying is, you know, there's a way in which we can work with individual polarities that Barry's been talking about, and we can choose one pole over the other to our detriment, you know, and we end up getting one downside and then both downsides, and we end up seeing evil or looking for the source of evil outside of us, projecting all of these things that happen, even just with one polarity. And polarities are everywhere, and we're always working with them. And so when we have a tendency to choose what I would call the masculine side of all polarities over the feminine side of all polarities, you can kind of stack the polarities in a list. Then you get something that's a really big pattern that causes something like patriarchy. And it's not just about, you know, declaring that men are better than women, or men should have more power than women, or men should be in the workplace and women shouldn't. It's not that simple. It's really about the values, the polarity values that society has chosen over the years as better, more dominant, more right, more good than, you know, than others. So for example, law would go on the masculine side. Grace would go on the feminine side.
Yes.
Competition would go on the masculine, collaboration on the feminine, you know. So there are lots of examples of that, which I talk about in our work. And I just want to hear Barry say a little bit about what you see. What I've done in Sophia Leadership and what we're doing in the center, in the Sanctuary for Sacred Union, is working at the master polarity level, at the level of the, you know, sort of the whole system, and looking at our human tendency to want to choose the masculine values over the feminine values, and the detriment and the damage that has caused.
I think that you're, you know, onto something very important, and that is that probably one of the most fundamental polarities is the polarity of masculine and feminine. And as you've said, Allison, it shows up within us and it shows up between us. And so, yeah, I think it's very powerful. One of the first polarity that I put on the top of my stack when I stack them is the polarity of or and in the first place. So or thinking is very essential and important. It's the basis by which we differentiate our nose from our feet when we're telling our children, teaching language. So without or thinking, you can't differentiate anything from anything else. So when we teach our children, whatever language we're teaching them is our language, we are letting them know that the nose is we touch the nose and ask them, what's this? As we do our initial testing of whether they're picking this up. What is this? And they say nose, and you get all excited, they get all excited. And then you touch their ear. What is this? And they say ear. Well, what you're doing there is you're saying there's a difference between the nose and the ear. And that's why we call them different things. So it's very basic that we need to have or thinking. We need to be able to differentiate. So that's essential. The problem is when we bring that problem solving, what is this, what is that, when we bring that to a polarity, to an interdependent pair, we treat that interdependent pair as if we need to make a choice. Are we going to centralize or decentralize? Are we going to follow the law, or are we going to provide mercy and forgiveness? And when we put or, which we bring naturally from our upbringing in every culture, when we bring or to a situation in which and is required, we have created, we've set ourselves up for some kind of pain and dysfunction. And the only question is how much. And so if we make this choice, this unconscious bias for or thinking, and as you said, Allison, if we use that for a whole series of polarities, then it becomes really dysfunctional. And so some that I have put together that I think are fundamental. One is or thinking and thinking itself. So they themselves are a polarity. And what's important for people who are listening in on this to understand is that Allison and TJ and I aren't talking about rejecting or thinking in order to go to and thinking as if it was superior or better. The rejection of or thinking is an example of or thinking. It's like what do you have to do? Are you going to do or thinking, or are you going to do and thinking? No, it's or thinking and thinking. So that's a basic polarity in the front end when we're looking at these. But if you unconsciously, again, through our upbringing, through our learning to problem solve and take tests all through grade school, high school, whatever, or even in the culture, when we learn a language, we learn about or thinking. So if we bring that unconscious bias, now we have unconsciously chosen or thinking whenever we experience a conflict. Whose side do I take? So if we bring that or thinking now, that's the first choice. The first false choice, often unconscious, is for or thinking. When we bring that or thinking to the natural desire to protect our loved ones, our family, our country, what happens is we then assume from an or thinking mindset around the issue of power that we have to either claim power or share power. And the assumption is if I share power, I'm going to lose power because it's a zero-sum game in the or mindset. So if Allison and I are struggling over power, and I think, well, wait a minute, if we have a limited amount of power, which is 10, and if Allison takes 6, I'm only going to have 4. So I have to figure, and so now if she's got 6 and I've got 4, I'm vulnerable. Everything I value is vulnerable to the fact that she's got 6. So what I'm going to do is try to figure, well, how can I get at least 6? So only she's got 4, so I can protect myself from anything she'd want to do because I've got more power. So the whole power struggle that shows up, the United States, for example, the motto of the Department of Defense that I've had the privilege to work with is serve and protect, right? Now, notice that actually is an interesting combination of yin and yang energy or masculine and feminine energy. But if you focus on the protect side, then what you do is you invest a lot of money, time, and energy to making sure that you have the best equipment, the most powerful equipment. It's no accident that the United States spends more on the Department of Defense than the next 7 countries' military budgets combined. Now, that's a lot of money. When people say, well, where are we going to find the money to pay, to feed people? Well, the answer is, maybe you don't have to spend 7 times as much as, spend, the equivalent of 7 other next countries in the world in their military budget. You might take some from that if we're looking at where we could draw from. But that desire to protect leads to, combined with or thinking, leads to claiming power without sharing power. when you claim power without sharing power, it becomes an abuse of power. And so that's one polarity there. And you're trying to gather up enough power to essentially dominate. So you create those going after power. If they have the military power to pull it off, then they can become the dominant culture. Now, when you become a dominant culture, you now have marginalized cultures who have relatively less power and who you are dominating. The rationale for dominating the marginalized cultures is the same rationale you use to perpetuate the domination. So for my ancestors, white Western Europeans coming to this land, North America, Turtle Island, coming here and making that assumption that we need to have power over, we end up gaining power over native peoples and taking their land. And then we have slaves arriving in shackles, so we have power over them. All we have to do is buy them, and they can work the land. So now we have this dominant culture dealing with, we have racism here showing up clearly, and the marginalization of others. And the more abusive we are in our marginalization, the more inhumane we are in our process of dominance, the more inhumane we will define the others in order to legitimate our own inhumanity to them. Mm-hmm. So what we can call native peoples savages, and that sort of somehow is supposed to increase our right to take their land, right? It also is now our right to keep the land, and to not share it. And so this whole power dimension, when we gain military superiority over somebody, from that position of superiority, we can now make all sorts of claims about why we won. How is it that we defeated the native peoples? Well, we must be brighter. We must be, more effective. We have a better culture. More enlightened, exactly. We get this whole smarter, yeah, right. We have this whole list of shit we can project on ourselves, and own for ourselves, and then project on them. Matter of fact, anything we don't want to own, we can project on the marginalized. So if in my culture it's valuable to be smart, they become dumb. If it's whatever is valued, you can claim as the dominant culture, and whatever you don't value, you can project on those you have marginalized as a legitimization for the marginalization. Yeah. Now, so that's about claiming power and sharing power.
So let me just pause you here, because this is so important. I think this is actually one of the biggest things that I learned from you over the years, the last 16 years, is that in the process of living and being and swimming in the world of polarities, which we all do and can't help to do, power is a factor. It's a big factor in how polarities get worked, leveraged. And those who have power, those who claim power by virtue of their military dominance or just their physical strength or whatever it is, those who are in power get to set the dominant culture by choosing their favorite poles and deciding that the interdependent pole is not good. And that's how we get to a culture like we have right now, a patriarchal culture.
Yes, exactly. And what is the unconscious part of all of it is the either or mindset.
Right.
So the either or mindset is, well, we can't be both competitive and collaborative. And we're creating the false choice between competition and collaboration, and we'll choose competition. Mm-hmm. See what I mean?
Or we'll choose the interests of the company over the interests of the planet,
Yes, exactly. And by the way, just to build on that, Allison, if you put either my family or my company or my country, if we put any of those things we value, I really value my family, I value my organization, my grandfather built it and I'm really proud of it, if I value the organization, if I value my country, put any of those things to the degree I value them and I connect those words to the environment with the word or, the choice is made. Do I protect my family or do I take care of the environment? If it's an or message, an unconscious message, the answer is going to be the environment's going to lose.
Right.
I mean, it's just how it happens. And so what's very important is that's why the and thinking, introducing the possibility that you could have both care for my family and take care of the environment. As a matter of fact, the combination is not only about family or environment, it's a short-term focus and a long-term focus. Mm-hmm. So if we combine my family now or the environment in the future, I'm going to take my family now, right? So, but the problem is that what we do, if we take the family now, we set the family up for not surviving, the lineage not surviving in the future if we don't protect the environment. So just another example of this that shows up in the book, in 1997, when the United States Senate voted 95-0 to not sign the Kyoto Protocol on the environment, right? The reason we did not sign it, and think of it, this wasn't a close call, 95-0. Right? Because the either or assumption, we can't take care of our nation and our business and industry and take care of the environment. So they said it's not in, quote, the national interest to sign the Kyoto Protocol. Now, when we...
And this is exactly what happened recently, too, when President Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement.
It's exactly the same. And the reason he got a lot of support for it, because it was the same or thinking addressing the issue. So a lot of people said, glad you did that because America first. It's like America first is a good example of focusing on the United States. And when you put the United States or something else, or the UN, or the environment, whatever that you connect with or, the United States with or, it's un-American, quote, to assume, to choose the other. So we create the false choice, we make the choice, and then we pay for it. And in terms of the climate crisis, all of humanity is going to pay for it.
Right.
More than humanity will pay for it.
Yes, all living things could pay for it.
Indeed.
All our relations.
Indeed.
I have another question coming up that's just coming up for me now. I'm wondering where you think you want to take this conversation.
Well, it's just reminding me, for one, our conversations in the last few minutes of why the book "And" is so important at this time. Mm-hmm. Because the cost of polarization is seemingly getting higher. Human tools and human cultures are combining to create a greater consequence. Human population is part of that, but the consequences now can't be shrugged off, or it goes all the way from the way we're counting votes in the election and the Senate. And I think the anxiety around that, of course, is all coming from or thinking. We cannot share power. The leaning on the pole of claiming power and the zero-sum game, which is kind of implicit in voting in a way, in a limited amount of votes in the Senate or the House or wherever in the nation even. Mm-hmm. It's really striking me in a new way at this moment, because there's such a dedication to, we will not be able to have our power, or something horrendous or terrible, the downside of the other pole, will destroy us. This is the setup we have right now, at least in United States politics, and maybe more around the world. And that's it's sobering to see it from this polarity light, to see how deep that attachment to claiming power is. I mean, not the ultimate, but one of the key symptoms would be the shock when it was time to appoint a new Supreme Court justice. And basically the Senate just said, we're not going to do it. And that was them saying, we cannot share power with you. because we believe the consequence will be devastating. And so we will claim the power that we believe we can and just not share any at all.
Yeah.
And that sets us, it's part of that descending spiral, the vicious cycle that happens when you have polarization. Things will just get worse.
The message that you are bringing that is so important, why I'm proud to be a part of the board, is that the source of the self-correction to where we have come is the feminine. The source is the neglected other pole, and the cluster that fits within that dimension. And what is one of the gifts coming from the feminine is the willingness to share power in the first place.
And to consider the whole, not
Yeah,
just the parts.
exactly. And so in that process, let's take, for example, women attempting to get the right to vote in the United States. That right to vote was a combination of claiming power for women. Adult women should have the right to vote. And it was talking about sharing power. Notice the effort to get the right to vote by women and men who were male allies, was never about telling the people who already had the right to vote, no, we want the right to vote, we want to claim it, and men won't have it anymore. It wasn't about a power flip, right? No, we want the power, you can't have it. What was about it is, no, we're claiming our power, of course, in a dimension of sharing. I mean, it's like, it is so obvious when you look at it from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And
The and is right there in the assertion that women and men should have the right to vote.
Exactly. And the whole civil rights movement about marginalized people of color in the United States, black people having the right to vote. It was not about, well, black people have the right to vote and white people shouldn't have the right to vote. I mean, that doesn't even enter the discussion. I mean, it's just because it's a notion. Wait, all we're saying is we ought to have adult black people ought to have the right to vote in this country. It should be a human right. It fits with our Declaration of Independence in the first place, you know. And so how about if we have it? But it wasn't a discussion about, well, let's figure out how we can get it, and we'll just take it away from white people. You know, that wasn't in the proposal anywhere.
But it does seem to get reacted to as if it is a power grab.
Exactly.
And not a power share. And
you're right, because it's a zero-sum game by those hearing it. Wait a minute. And it's showing up in this election. What happens now that black people have the right to vote? What happens if people of color actually are the majority of the voting group? You know,
right.
Well, it's not a problem from a sharing power, claiming power, sharing power perspective, but it's very risky from somebody who's still caught in an either or notion, a white person who's caught in an either or notion about power. Whoops, if they've got 60% of the votes, we're going to be somehow harmed, or we're going to be,
right.
We are so vulnerable to that. And so now I got this fear of protecting, and part of that fear, I submit, is it's a projection on people of color about what might happen. What would I do as a white person, knowing how we have a history of abuse of black people? How would I behave if I all of a sudden had power over white people? So we're projecting on them how dangerous I would be if I finally got power, because of that reaction. That's what makes people, for example, afraid. I lived in East Harlem for 5 years. I was never even called a name as a white person living in East Harlem for 5 years. I was never in danger, nor was my wife, nor our 2 kids. This is important, because this is a neighborhood that is seen as dangerous. It is seen as so dangerous by people outside of East Harlem at that time that I would invite friends to come to visit us and have dinner at our apartment, and they would not come.
Right.
Now, they just would not, they said, that's dangerous. I said, wait a minute, I've been living here now for 4 years, been walking the streets, got our kids here. It's not dangerous. They would tell me, having never been there, they would tell me, no, you're wrong, it's dangerous, right? And I would say to them, look, I will take a cab to the front door. I'll meet you at the cab. I'll walk you up to our apartment. We'll have our meal. I'll take you back downstairs. We'll call a cab before we go downstairs. I'll walk you to the cab, put you in the cab, and you'll be safe. No, I'm not coming.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, so
Wow.
what is this fear about?
Mm-hmm.
This fear, I submit, is part of white people's fear of black people. It's a projection of how we are afraid we might in fact act if we had been abused as much as they have been abused. And so that's what makes us anxious. And what you need to experience the fact, as I did for 5 years, that projection is not true.
Right.
But as long as you maintain the projection and have no experience to counter it, because you live where they live in the other side of town where you're afraid to go, if that's your projection screen, then you just don't have the opportunity to recognize that when black people are asking for a vote, all they want is the damn vote. Right. So anyway,
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. It gives us another example of how the polarity map helps us look into the dynamic, that there is a downside, and the downside from the preferred pole will look across and say, well, that other pole is dangerous.
Yes.
It is not just,
Or even at worst,
evil,
not human.
Not human.
Evil.
There's a whole list of, you can go deeper and deeper into that degradation. It doesn't matter that we take these children away from their parents at the border because, of course, they don't deserve human courtesy because of this, fill in the blank, this transgression, this, so there are a lot of stacked polarities there that justify such inhumane treatment that's shocking to the rest of the world because it's a polarization.
Right. And we can't, the way to protect ourselves psychologically and emotionally from our inhumaneness to others, I mentioned this earlier, is to make them less than human.
Yes.
Otherwise, we can't live with treating them as less than human. But if we can somehow make them less than human, then it's okay. And by the way, in terms of projections, we'll just deal with this. We talked already about the need to project and deflect. If we can't own stuff, we need to find somebody to project on. And I talk about this in the book. There's two important dimensions to having somebody. You need a good projection screen, right? So it needs to be somebody who's handy, relatively close at hand, and it needs to be somebody who is obviously not me. So if we just think about it real quickly, who would be most dangerous to me as a white male? If I had a lot of power to throw around, those who would be most dangerous to my projecting what I can't own onto them would be people of color and women, because they're the most obvious not me. So I didn't do it, they did. And the fact of their clarity of their not being me makes them the best projection screen. Right? And so that's why, to me as a man, women are vulnerable to me projecting what I can't own onto them. And if you're obviously a woman, then it's more obvious the projection screen. Now, if you mess with someone's projection screen, you will be resented because you're not making it clean. So in the 60s and 70s, men with long hair and wearing rings were under attack. Why were they under attack? Because they were messing with the convenience of knowing whether this was someone I could project my shit on or not. And so taking away that clarity, and this is why transgender issues are so important, because you're taking away my clarity about who's the not me that I can project on the stuff I don't want to own. Now, if it's not clear, then you will systematically make it clear. The best example of this is the antagonism and the projection on Jews during the rise of the Third Reich. It wasn't obvious necessarily who's a Jew. You couldn't tell. It's not as clear as black or female, right? But so what did they force all the Jews to do? When you are in public, you will wear on your outer garment a Star of David, because that tells us that you're the one we can hate. That tells us we're the one we can project our shit on. You're the ones that we can project our shit on, and you're the ones that we can send to ovens. We have to be clear about who they are in order to have that clean projection screen to now abuse them coming out of our own inability to own our own stuff. Remember the gunman who came to Washington to shoot the people who were playing baseball. Remember, it was representative in anticipation of this.
Yeah.
On his way to do the shooting, he had to ask whether it was Republicans who were practicing or whether it was Democrats, because he had to know whether he could shoot them or not.
Yes.
Think about this. It's the clarity of the not me. You have to have it before you can be abusive. And so anyway, that's what happens with again, when you've got that power and you end up needing a projection screen. Let me take it one step further. I'm getting a little bit wound up here, but it's
you're preaching.
It's no accident. It's no accident that both white people and black people agreed that President Obama was the first black president of the United States. The only people who I've heard seriously question that are people who are in a biracial family. He was as much a white president as he was a black president biologically, right? He was a mutt, as he called himself, right?
Yep.
Now, so why is it that we all agreed, oh, he's the first black president? Because it's convenient for both of our projection screens. It makes it clear. If he's the black president, then white people who want to project their shit on him can. He's convenient because they say he's the first black president. If you're a black person and you want to project your ideal self on him, it's better if he's a black president than a biracial president. So it became a collusive projection screen for both of us. We use projection screens to project our ideal self and our despised self. And so both of them had an ideal self and despised self to project on. And so we all agreed he's the first black president.
Right.
So
this is so good, because I think it takes us to the work that we're doing, which really is, an answer to the question of how do we begin to heal all of this that we've been talking about. And one of the ways that we see is by helping people to find the me in the not me and bring them all together into a more integrated whole self, so that there isn't a despised self and an idealized self, so that there is a whole human being, as Yeshua and Mary Magdalene would talk about, the whole human being, the anthropos, that they were, that was the mission of the work, to bring us all to this place where we can hold all beingness inside ourself, and therefore not hate or project or harm other people.
Yeah, and one of the contexts for that is being loved. And so that's what's so central, is the knowing we're loved unconditionally. Experience ourselves being loved unconditionally allows us to own our shortcomings. And without the ability to own it, we will project it. So the importance of the owning and belonging, all of us need to somehow become aware that we belong just as we are. It's not about paying some ticket to get to belong to the party. We all belong. And that message helps us own up to the stuff, because owning our shortcomings doesn't mean I don't belong. I belong. That's it. And that radically undermines my need to project stuff I can't own onto others. And so that's central. And that, by the way, is again the feminine. It's the feminine. Mechanically, what we do, or sociologically, what we do, is we need to bring, we need to supplement or thinking with and thinking, and we need to listen, as the dominant culture needs to listen to the marginalized culture, to the culture we have marginalized, because they have better access to both parts than the dominant culture does. And so we can learn from, we can understand, we can say, help us understand this from your perspective as somebody we've marginalized for how many centuries or how many years. And so that's where the source is. And it's not putting the dominant culture down, it's just recognizing the limits of the dominant culture, which is you don't appreciate. The reason you're in the dominant culture is, first of all, is you don't understand how to claim power and share power. So you need to learn that from people who know how to do it. And that will be marginalized folks.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Wow. This has been a really rich conversation. It's wonderful to be in it. And the conversation will continue down the road as you continue your work. So we want to, for one, thank you, Barry, for this body of work and your continued working. Thank you for issuing the And book, both Volume 1 and soon to be released Volume 2. What are your hopes? Just one last piece. What are your hopes for moving forward from here? I know the books, both volumes coming out, And is out, Volume 1, and Volume 2 is shortly to follow.
Well, one of my continued hope is that our mission expands, which is to enhance our quality of life on the planet by supplementing or thinking with and thinking. So I appreciate very much the work that you are doing, which is directly in line with our mission in terms of your helping supplement or thinking with and thinking in the creative and unique ways that you have. So, and that you've been doing it, and just my hope is that you continue to do that and bring it to with the rest of us to the world.
Well, thank you so much for your support over the years. I feel really blessed to have you in my life, Barry.
Well, me as well. So,
yeah, that's our hope too, to be part of what you're doing in our way at the Sanctuary for Sacred Union. So, thanks everybody for joining us, and thank you, Barry, from the bottom of our hearts for your presence. Yeah. We look forward to more.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
The Pastor and Priestess is brought to you by the Sanctuary for Sacred Union. You can find us on the web or on Facebook.
Our music is composed and performed by Christian Chamberlain.
The Pastor and Priestess is recorded in Boulder, Colorado at Sunrise Studios, which sits on traditional Arapaho Nation lands.
The Sanctuary for Sacred Union supports Right Relationship Boulder, a volunteer organization seeking to promote and practice right relationship with Native peoples.
Thanks for listening.